I felt it before I understood it. A warmth creeping up my spine, a pulse in my fingertips, a shift in the air that made my skin tighten. It was nothing, I told myself. Just a moment. Just an accident. But deep down, I knew. It happened during a Sunday family gathering, one of those afternoons that blended into all the others. Laughter, the clinking of glasses, the comforting murmur of voices talking over each other. The smell of grilled meat and fresh-cut grass lingered in the air, mixing with the warmth of the setting sun. My husband stood across the yard, deep in conversation with his brother, his hands moving as he spoke. I knew his gestures by heart, the way his fingers tapped against his glass when he was making a point, the slight tilt of his head when he listened. I should have been paying attention to him, but I wasn't. I was in the kitchen, refilling my wine glass when I felt it. The presence behind me, close enough to sense the heat radiating off his body. Close enough that my breath caught for just a second. I turned slightly, enough to see him out of the corner of my eye. My husband's nephew. It should have meant nothing. I had known him since he was a teenager, had watched him grow into a man. He was family. At least, that's what I had always told myself. But in that moment, with only inches between us, something changed. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. His eyes lingered, dark and unreadable, and I knew he was testing something. Watching for my reaction. A light touch, barely there. A brush of fingers against the fabric of my dress, right at my waist. It was so fleeting, so subtle that I might have convinced myself I imagined it. Except I didn't. I felt my breath hitch, my fingers tightening around the stem of my glass. My first instinct was to move away, to step forward, to put distance between us. But I didn't. And that was the moment I realized the danger. Because I wasn't horrified. I wasn't disgusted. I wasn't even angry. I was frozen. Not in fear, not in shock, but in something far worse, something that curled low in my stomach, something that made my pulse stutter in a way I hadn't felt in years. He hesitated too, as if waiting for me to react. But I didn't. And then, as quickly as it had happened, the moment passed. He stepped back, leaving space between us, and I finally exhaled. The room around me came back into focus. The sound of clinking plates, laughter from the yard, the low hum of a conversation drifting in from the hallway. Normalcy. Routine. I forced myself to move, to step forward and place my glass on the counter. My hands trembled slightly, but I ignored it. Nothing happened. That was the truth. It was nothing. And yet, as I turned to walk back outside, I felt his eyes on me. A silent understanding passed between us. This wasn't over. The morning felt the same as always. Quiet, predictable, unremarkable. I woke up before my husband, staring at the ceiling, listening to his steady breathing beside me. The weight of the previous evening still clung to my skin, that brief, forbidden moment refusing to fade from my memory. I told myself it didn't matter, that it had been nothing, but the way my heart clenched at the thought told a different story. I got out of bed without making a sound, moving through the motions of my routine as if everything were normal. The kitchen was still dim, the early light filtering through the curtains. I started the coffee machine, the scent of freshly brewed beans filling the air, grounding me in the familiar. This was my life. Structured, steady, comforting. The kind of life most people dream of. Pouring myself a cup, I leaned against the counter, fingers wrapped around the warm ceramic. The house was quiet, the only sound the ticking of the clock above the sink. My mind drifted back, against my will, to the way my pulse had quickened, to the lingering sensation of heat where his fingers had brushed against my waist. It had been an accident, a meaningless touch. And yet, my body had betrayed me, reacting in a way that should never have happened. I shook my head, pushing the thought away. I had to focus on reality, on what mattered. My husband entered the kitchen, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He moved through his routine with practiced ease, pouring himself a cup of coffee, checking his phone as he sat at the table. It was a dance we had perfected over the years. Silent mornings, comfortable pauses, no unnecessary words. I should have been reassured by the ease of it, by the way we fit together without effort. But instead, it felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. I forced myself to eat, though I barely tasted the food. Across from me, he scrolled through emails, already half absorbed in his work. It was a routine I had come to expect. He was a good man, dedicated, reliable, the kind of husband anyone would want. I had no reason to feel unsatisfied, no reason to crave anything beyond what we had built together. And yet, there was an emptiness I couldn't ignore. There had been a time when things were different, when his touch sent shivers down my spine, when I could see the hunger in his eyes, when I had felt wanted. But time had softened everything, turning passion into comfort, replacing urgency with familiarity. Love hadn't disappeared, but it had settled into something calmer, something safe. I had told myself that was enough. That real love wasn't about fire, but about endurance. Still, my thoughts drifted back to the way my breath had hitched the night before, to the feeling of being completely awake in a way I hadn't been in years. Guilt coiled in my stomach at the memory, a sharp reminder that I had no right to feel this way. I glanced at my husband. He didn't notice. He trusted me, believed in me, never once questioned my loyalty. And why would he? There had never been a reason to. Until now. I pushed back my chair, the sound barely audible over the quiet hum of the house. I needed air, space, anything to clear my head. Stepping outside, the morning air was crisp, filling my lungs with a cold sharpness that should have jolted me back to reality. But the weight in my chest didn't fade. The truth was settling in, sinking deep into my bones. This wasn't just a passing thought, a fleeting moment of weakness. It was something else, something dangerous. And no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I knew. This was only the beginning. The party had started hours ago, but I felt like I had only just arrived. Time had lost its meaning, blurring into a haze of indistinct conversations, the low hum of background music, the rhythmic clinking of glasses. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and wine, bodies moving past each other in a slow, effortless dance of social interactions. I had been here before. This exact scene, this exact rhythm. It should have felt familiar, comforting even. But tonight, it didn't. Tonight, something was different. Or maybe I was different. I had spent the last hour navigating through conversations, nodding at the right moments, laughing at jokes that didn't quite land. My husband had been by my side, his hand resting lightly on my waist, the way it always did at events like these. To everyone else, we must have looked like the perfect couple, poised, polished, predictable. But inside, something was unraveling. I had felt his presence before I had even seen him. A pull at the edge of my consciousness, an awareness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. And when I finally spotted him across the room, leaning casually against the bar, my stomach tightened. I told myself not to react. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself 100 different things, and yet I still felt the air shift the moment our eyes met. It wasn't supposed to mean anything. It wasn't supposed to feel like this. I turned away too quickly, forcing myself into another conversation. A woman I barely knew was talking about her latest vacation, her voice animated, hands gesturing wildly. I nodded at the right moments, sipped my drink, smiled when expected. But I wasn't listening. I couldn't. Because I could still feel him watching me. The weight of his gaze burned into my skin, even as I pretended not to notice. I should have left. I should have found my husband and stayed by his side. I should have done anything but what I did next. Instead, I found myself drifting toward the bar, toward him, as if some invisible force was pulling me there. It wasn't intentional. At least, that's what I told myself. But my body moved before my mind could catch up. And suddenly, I was standing there, close enough to smell the faint scent of his cologne, close enough to feel the heat radiating from him. A waiter passed, offering another glass of wine. I took it, more for something to hold than to drink. I should have walked away. Instead, I let the silence stretch between us, heavy, charged. Then he moved. Not much, just a slight shift, his fingers grazing against my hand as he reached for his own drink. Barely a touch, almost accidental. But it wasn't. I knew it. And so did he. My breath caught. I didn't pull away. I didn't step back. And in that single second, the entire world tilted off its axis. It was reckless. It was a mistake. And yet, as I finally turned to face him, as my lips parted slightly, as my pulse pounded in my ears, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was only the beginning. I had always prided myself on being in control of my life, of my emotions, of the choices I made. Yet, as the days passed since that night at the party, I found myself slipping further from the grasp of the woman I had always been. At first, it was easy to pretend. I went through the motions, working, spending time with my husband, meeting friends. I laughed when it was expected. I listened when needed, and I performed my role as if nothing had changed. But in the quiet moments, when I was alone with my thoughts, the memory of him lingered, like an itch I couldn't scratch. The thought of him wasn't new. It wasn't even the first time I had noticed something about him. There had always been a quiet intensity to him, a kind of sharpness that stood out against the backdrop of my husband's easygoing nature. He wasn't a child anymore, not the boy I'd known years ago. He had grown into something else, someone who made my heart beat faster without even trying. And now, after that moment at the party, I couldn't escape the pull he had on me. It started slowly, like a creeping fog, clouding my mind at odd times. When I was washing dishes, when I was alone in the bathroom, even when I was sitting next to my husband on the couch, watching television, trying to focus on the screen. My mind would wander, and there it was. The image of him, that dark look in his eyes, the weight of his touch that still burned in my memory. I couldn't control it anymore. There were moments when I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I needed to stop thinking about it, that I had everything I wanted, everything I needed. But those moments were fleeting, and the rest of the time I was consumed by it. The desire was always there, simmering beneath the surface, pushing me toward him in ways I couldn't explain. The next time I saw him was at another family gathering. The event was supposed to be casual, a simple dinner with no expectations. But the moment he walked into the room, I felt it. This tightening in my chest, a nervous anticipation that I couldn't shake. He was different this time. There was no subtle brush of the hand, no accidental glances. This time, he knew what had passed between us, and I could see it in the way he looked at me. It was a game now. I didn't know who started it, who had crossed the line first, but I felt the shift in the air as soon as we exchanged a look. It was dangerous, reckless, something we should have never allowed. But it was too late. The spark was already there. We didn't speak directly. We didn't have to. The tension between us was thick, suffocating. I could feel his presence in the room even when he wasn't near me. His eyes would linger on me for just a moment longer than they should have, his gaze heavy, full of unspoken things. And I would find myself drawn to him, despite every part of me telling me to stay away. I could feel my pulse quicken whenever he was close. The weight of his attention made my skin prickle with awareness, and I hated it. I hated how he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't been in years. I hated how my body responded to him even when my mind screamed for me to pull back. But I couldn't. There was a strange power in the way he looked at me, as if he knew something I didn't. As if he could see right through me into the parts of myself that I had long buried. And I knew, without a doubt, that he wasn't just playing. Neither of us was playing. This was real. And that realization made it even more dangerous. I spent the evening trying to keep my composure, trying to focus on anything other than the way my heart pounded in my chest whenever he was near. I told myself that it was nothing, that it was just a momentary lapse, just a passing phase. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. It had already gone too far. And now there was no turning back. It wasn't supposed to happen again. I had convinced myself that I could control it, that I could keep my distance, keep my emotions buried beneath the surface where no one could see them. But control is a fragile thing, and when it's based on a lie, it's bound to break. The next time I saw him, I knew. I could feel the shift before he even stepped into the room. It wasn't just the way he looked at me, or the way his body moved through the space, but the tension in the air that pulled us toward each other, as if some invisible force was drawing us in. It was no longer a fleeting glance or an accidental touch. This time, it was deliberate. He knew what I was thinking, and I knew what he was thinking. There was no more pretending, no more avoiding. It had escalated. We were both complicit, both willing participants in something that had gone far beyond the bounds of decency. I could feel it building, like a pressure inside me, a knot in my stomach that refused to loosen. The attraction, the longing, the need, all of it swirled together in a dangerous cocktail that clouded my judgment. I didn't want to feel this way. I didn't want him, but there was no turning back. The moment we were alone, I could feel the gravity between us. There was nothing left to say. No more games to play? His hand brushed against my arm as he moved past me, a touch that should have been innocent but was anything but. The room seemed to shrink, the air thick with anticipation. It happened so quickly I didn't have time to think. He was standing in front of me, his eyes locked on mine, his breath shallow. And then his lips were on mine, warm, urgent. A kiss that held the promise of everything we couldn't say. It was over before I could even register it. A fleeting moment that carried the weight of everything that had come before and everything that would follow. I should have pulled away. I should have stopped it. Should have shoved him off and reminded myself of what I had, what I could lose. But I didn't. Instead, I let myself be pulled deeper into it. His hands found my waist, his touch a stark contrast to the coldness that had settled in my chest. I didn't know what I was doing anymore. Didn't know who I was. Didn't know where I ended and where he began. All I knew was that this feeling was real. And it was intoxicating. The kiss broke, but I didn't move away. We stood there, inches apart, neither of us speaking, neither of us needing to. The world outside of that room didn't exist anymore. The people in the house, the lives we were supposed to lead, all of it faded into the background as we stood on the precipice, teetering on the edge of something far beyond our control. And that terrified me. I wanted to run. I wanted to turn and walk away, to erase this from my life and pretend it had never happened. But even as I thought it, I knew it was too late. The moment had already passed. The boundary had already been crossed. I was already too far gone. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. There was no more denial, no more pretending. The silence between us was loaded with understanding. He didn't ask for an explanation, and I didn't offer one. All that mattered was the fact that we were here, in this moment, caught in something that we couldn't undo. My mind raced with 1,000 conflicting thoughts. What did this mean? What would happen next? Would he try to push further? Would I let him? I didn't know. I didn't know what any of this meant, but I couldn't stop it. I couldn't stop him. As I left the room, my pulse still pounding in my ears, I realized something I had been denying all along. There was no going back. This wasn't a mistake anymore. This wasn't something that could be easily erased or ignored. This was real, and it was happening, and I was a part of it. It was only a matter of time before everything changed. The days following the kiss were a blur, but not in the way I wanted. I had hoped that the overwhelming rush of emotions would fade, that I could compartmentalize it and move on with my life as if nothing had happened. But reality doesn't work that way. No matter how hard I tried to push it down, it refused to stay buried. I couldn't think of anything else. My every thought was consumed by what had transpired, by the taste of his lips, the warmth of his touch, the weight of his gaze. Even when I was with my husband, sitting across from him at dinner or lying next to him in bed, it was him I could see in my mind. His face, his body, the way he made me feel as if everything else in the world disappeared when he was near. I tried to pretend, of course. I smiled when I was expected to smile. I laughed when the conversation warranted it. I moved through my days as if nothing had changed. But inside, everything had. There were moments when I caught myself staring at my husband, as if seeing him for the first time. I wondered if he noticed the distance growing between us. He hadn't said anything, and perhaps he never would. He trusted me, and I was careful not to show any sign that things weren't as they seemed. But the truth was, things had already shifted. The cracks had already appeared, and no matter how much I tried to hide it, I knew they were only getting bigger. I had started to avoid him. My husband. Not because I didn't love him, but because I couldn't stop thinking about the other man. The more I saw him, the more I felt the pull. It was impossible to ignore. He was there, in every room I entered, in every conversation, in the space between my husband and me. It wasn't just about the kiss anymore. It had evolved into something deeper. It had become an obsession, a need that I couldn't explain. Every time I saw him, every time our eyes met, I felt that electric charge that was impossible to ignore. The touch, the moments of connection were becoming more frequent, more intense. I hated it. I hated myself for allowing this to happen, for letting things escalate the way they had. But every time I tried to stop it, it felt like I was fighting against something much bigger than me. One evening, I found myself standing in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection. I barely recognized the woman looking back at me. Who was she? What had happened to the woman who had been content with the life she had built? I had everything: love, security, stability. And yet, I felt like I was falling apart at the seams. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. I wasn't sure if I expected some kind of epiphany, some moment of clarity that would tell me what to do. But I didn't get it. Instead, I saw someone lost, someone trapped in a cycle of her own making. The next day, I received a message from him. It was short, simple, but it sent a ripple of anxiety through me. He wanted to meet. It was clear what he was asking. He didn't need to say it explicitly, and neither did I. We both knew what was happening. See, I was terrified. But at the same time, I felt something else. Something that made me hesitate before responding. It was a desire, a hunger, a need that I couldn't ignore. I had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. I couldn't say no. I knew that I should walk away and put an end to all of this before it went any further. But the truth was, I couldn't bring myself to do it. Not anymore. The message from him had lingered in my mind, gnawing at me, whispering promises I knew I shouldn't entertain. It was clear what he wanted, and even clearer that I wanted it too. The realization should have scared me, but it didn't. Instead, it filled me with a strange sense of anticipation, a thrill that made my heart race every time I thought about it. The days passed in a haze of restless thoughts. I would be sitting at home, alone, while my husband was at work, and my mind would wander back to him. To the way he looked at me, to the touch of his hand, to the way my entire body responded to him as though it was no longer my own. The physical need was so overwhelming, it was hard to focus on anything else. But I didn't give in immediately. I told myself I could control it. I told myself I could keep my distance. I told myself that I could let the feeling pass, that it was just a moment of weakness, that it was nothing more than a fleeting fantasy. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was already lost. The meeting was inevitable. The more I tried to suppress it, the more the pull toward him grew. When I finally agreed to meet, I told myself it was just to clear the air, just to get the tension out in the open. But even as I said it, I knew that was a lie. I wasn't meeting him to talk. I wasn't meeting him to make things right. I was meeting him because I wanted him. And that thought terrified me. The moment I stepped into the room where we had agreed to meet, everything changed. It was as if the air between us had thickened, charged with the energy of everything that had happened, everything that was about to happen. The room felt small, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there watching me, his eyes dark and intense as if he could see straight through me. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me, and for a moment, I almost couldn't breathe. It was like everything I had been trying to deny suddenly came rushing to the surface. I should have turned around and walked out. I should have left right then before it was too late. But instead, I found myself walking closer to him, drawn by some invisible force I couldn't explain. He reached out, almost casually, brushing a lock of hair from my face. The touch was electric, sending a jolt through my body. I closed my eyes for a moment just to steady myself, but when I opened them again, he was leaning in. I didn't pull back. I couldn't. The kiss was slow, deliberate, as if we were both savoring the moment that had been building between us for so long. The taste of him was intoxicating, the warmth of his body drawing me in further. It was dangerous. It was reckless. And it felt like the only thing that mattered. Everything outside of that room faded away. The consequences, the guilt, the lies, none of it existed in that moment. All that mattered was him. But even as I felt myself giving in, I knew I was being pulled into something I couldn't control. This wasn't a simple affair. This wasn't just about desire. It was about something deeper, something I hadn't allowed myself to admit until now. I had fallen into a trap of my own making. And now, there was no way out. When the kiss finally broke, I pulled away, but only slightly. We stood there, inches apart, both of us breathing heavily. The silence between us felt thick, laden with the weight of everything we hadn't said. He didn't look at me like he had before. There was no more questioning, no more uncertainty. Now it was clear. We both knew what was happening. And neither of us was ready to stop. The trap had closed around me, and I was no longer sure if I wanted to escape. I never imagined it would go this far. In the beginning, when the moments were fleeting and easily ignored, I convinced myself that it was nothing more than a passing attraction, a momentary lapse. But with every stolen glance, every brush of skin, every shared moment of silence, it became something bigger. And now, standing at the edge of what I had willingly stepped into, I felt the full weight of the consequences crashing down on me. I had crossed a line, one that I couldn't uncross. No amount of guilt, no amount of regret could undo what had been done. I had given in. I had let myself fall into something I knew was wrong. And now, the consequences were inevitable. The days after that meeting were a blur. I moved through them like a zombie, my mind constantly racing with thoughts of him, of what we had done, of what we would do next. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything other than the overwhelming need to be near him. Every moment I spent away from him felt like an eternity, and every moment I spent with him felt like I was slowly losing myself. My husband was oblivious, as he had always been. He continued to go about his days, absorbed in his work, his routine. I played my part, pretending everything was fine, even though inside I felt like I was slowly being consumed by the secret I kept from him. I could see the trust in his eyes, the love, and it made everything worse. It made it harder to look him in the face, to pretend that nothing had changed. I couldn't keep living like this, but I didn't know how to stop. Each time I saw him, I felt the pull getting stronger. It wasn't just about the physical attraction anymore. It wasn't just about the stolen kisses or the touches that left me breathless. It was deeper than that. He had a hold on me, one that I couldn't break free from, no matter how much I tried. He was inside my head, inside my heart, and every time I saw him, it was like I was falling further into the trap I had set for myself. I tried to distract myself. I buried myself in my work, threw myself into my daily routines, but nothing worked. Every time I closed my eyes, all I saw was him. Every time I heard his voice, every time I saw his smile, it was like I was drawn to him, unable to resist. And every time I saw my husband, the guilt would settle in like a stone in my chest, threatening to crush me. I couldn't keep pretending. I couldn't keep lying to myself, to him. But what was the alternative? What would happen if the truth came out? The consequences of what we had done were too much to bear. The lies, the betrayal, the broken trust. It would destroy everything. It would destroy my marriage, my life, and everything I had worked so hard to build. I found myself at a crossroads, torn between two lives, two worlds. One was safe, familiar, and stable. The other was wild, unpredictable, and dangerous. And in the center of it all was the choice I had to make. I thought about what would happen if I told my husband the truth. Would he understand? Could we move past this? Or would everything come crashing down? Would I lose him forever? And then, there was the other side. The side that tempted me to give in, to continue what had started, to let go of the guilt and embrace the desire. But as the days went on, I realized something. No matter which path I chose, no matter what decision I made, there was no going back. Things had already changed. The moment I crossed that line, I set in motion a chain of events that I couldn't stop. And the consequences were already waiting for me, lurking just around the corner, ready to pounce. I could feel the walls closing in on me, the weight of everything pressing down harder with each passing day. The longer I kept the secret, the harder it became to keep it from coming to light. But I wasn't ready to face the truth. Not yet. And so I kept living this double life, hiding behind the mask of normalcy, even though I knew it couldn't last forever. Sooner or later, the truth would come out. And when it did, I would have to face the consequences of my actions.